Welcome back to another episode of Money and More with me, Peter Komalafe. As you have probably learned from the first episode, we are taking a different direction. We're going to talk about money being the core at the forefront of what we talk about here on the podcast, but expanding into other topics. And one of the topics which I think is really important to touch on, especially given the fact that we've had cost of living crisis and it's still ongoing. I was reading a piece of research the other day, and it said, and this is from January this year, people, about 4.5 million people in the UK were thinking of taking a second job to keep up with the cost of living. And so this lends itself to career and this journey of what your career looks like. And I think in modern times, what we used to think was a straightforward journey, a straight line towards the top, is very, very different. And I've got the perfect person on as a guest this week to talk about Squiggly careers. So her name is Sarah. She is the founder of Amazing If, and Amazing If is dedicated to making career journeys better. So Sarah, thank you so much for joining me on this. I'm really excited to talk through what you guys do.
Thank you so much for inviting us. I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
So tell us a little bit about Amazing If and the work that you guys do, because you invited me to come and speak at one of your live podcast recordings, which I found really, really interesting. Lots of questions. And what struck me the most was you had a really good mix of employed, self-employed, people from different walks of life, different demographics, different age groups. Tell me a bit more about what you do.
So I think one of the things that we recognised, exactly as you've described, is that careers are no longer ladders. And it's a framework that we all fall back on because it's just been around for a really long time. Career ladders have been around for about 100 years. And so even though we're surrounded by uncertainty and change, and that's all of our realities, then we still sometimes default back to, well, the job to do is to climb each rung of the ladder step by step. And the further up that ladder that we are, the more successful we are. And also, we should all have the same view of success. Now, when you sort of zoom out from that for a second, you realise that that just doesn't feel fit for purpose anymore. Exactly as you described, no one has a straight line to success. We all develop in different directions. Of course, we've all got different motivators and drivers, and ambition is really personal. So we want everyone to be really ambitious for where their career can take them, but to do it in their own way. So that's where we came up with this idea of a squiggly career, one that is full of potential and possibilities, full of both opportunities and obstacles, often at the same time. It's much more dynamic. We're unlearning, relearning all of the time. Of course, inevitably, there are knotty moments, some of those tough times where maybe, something out of your control comes your way. So you were really enjoying your squiggly career, but then a restructure or redundancy happens. Or maybe it's just that you've got choices and you're just trying to navigate those choices. There's lots more choices in a squiggly career. So we just feel this idea of squiggly reflects everybody's experiences and probably our aspirations. We know we're going to have 4 or 5 different types of career. Probably that's a conservative estimate now in our working lives. We're retiring this idea of retirement. Unless your listeners have got like a massive pot of gold waiting for them, we're all probably going to be working for longer than our parents were. And that's potentially a good thing, potentially a good thing. We get a lot of meaning and fulfillment from the work that we do some of the time. But also that can be a bit demotivating if we feel like we're not doing things that we enjoy. So it's just, I think, recognizing now careers are personal. There's no such thing as one size fits all. And also we really want to support people to sort of take ownership and feel like they've got control over their squiggly career. This kind of create not wait attitude, rather than feeling like your development is dependent on maybe other people, or maybe even being guilty of expecting other people to do the hard work for us. So we want to be practically useful to really help people to navigate this squiggly career.
I love that. Create, not wait. And I guess even when I look at my own career, it has definitely been very, very squiggly. I mean, from where I started to where I am right now, it's almost like a complete 180 almost. And I think you've kind of had a similar journey in terms of your own career and its squiggliness, if you will.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people mistake squiggliness for, we're talking about job hopping, which traditionally we always felt like a kind of a bad thing.
A bad thing,
What we're
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Whereas I think we've got to let go of some of these. Again, that's a bit ladder like in terms of there's lots of ladder like language that gets in our way at work. What's my next step? Where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? That interview question that I would ban if I could. And I think when we think about squiggly careers, we're really trying to help people appreciate and use their transferable talents. I think everybody has got lots more transferable talents than they give themselves credit for. So you might have been doing something really different before, just like I was. So I was working in Sainsbury's here in the UK in a supermarket, doing things like marketing strategy. And I did initially what we would describe as squiggle and stay. So I stayed in big organizations for a long time, but I moved in lots of different directions. I transferred my talents from marketing to corporate responsibility. I then transferred my talents into a very different kind of organization. I never imagined I would end up running my own company. That felt so far away from my experiences and what I'd done so far in my career. And I think the thing that gave me the bravery, because it did feel like quite a brave move, I think we're always looking for confidence and clarity that I
Hmm.
could run my own company, at least potentially in brackets, was my transferable talents. I was like, well, what have I got that I can take with me? And less about what am I doing in my current day to day? My day to day in corporate responsibility or marketing strategy looked very different to today. But if I think about the sort of the squiggly threads that run through my career, there you've got lots of constants. If I think about the value that I added in those jobs versus in my job today, actually there's a lot of similarities. I think we've got to resist this, kind of being put into a box. And
Box,
sometimes other
yeah.
people pigeonhole us. And so we sort of get used to it. Sometimes we fall into that trap of shoulds. Well, this is what I feel like I should do. This is what other
Hmm.
people are telling me I should do. Like you, I've worked in financial services. And I remember working Barclays, really enjoying it, but thinking I'd like to experiment with a different industry. I'd like to move out of financial services, try a different industry. And everyone just saying to me, just get a more senior job in financial services, just earn more money in financial services, and almost completely missing the point in terms of what I was trying to do, and almost saying to me like, well, why would you bother? And I think if we can let go of this idea of step by step, and also see our career as a series of experiments. And the reason that I like that word experiments is I think smart experiments, we use data to inform them. So we're not just hoping for the best, we're being intentional. And what we do is we learn as we go. So some experiments are really successful, and then we're like, right, let's do more of that because I've found my flow. Some, there might be some good stuff, some not so good stuff. So you kind of go, right, okay, that's useful.
Hmm.
And sometimes experiments do fail. But as long as we learn from them, it's not like you suddenly then go, I have made a really bad choice. I'm just not smart enough for this, or I'm not good at what I do just because one job or one opportunity didn't work out. Actually, you view it as, okay, well, it's obviously not ideal. It's not what any of us would want, but at least then I've learned something about myself, and I can use that for then wherever I'm going to squiggle to next. So letting go of this binary black and white nature of
Yeah.
I'm either sort of winning or I'm losing when it comes to my career.
Yeah. I think it's really important to acknowledge as well. I think the world has definitely changed quite a bit. I mean, in 2024, the the possibilities are almost limitless in terms of the things that
Mm.
you can do. And I wonder whether you see that there's kind of like this connection of back in the 1950s and 60s. This is one that I often talk about a lot, when, especially when it comes to things like pensions. You would get a job back then, and you knew you had a job for life, and with
Yeah.
that came a guaranteed pension as well. Those
Mhm.
things have long since disappeared. So, do you think there's some kind of correlation between the way the world has changed and the fact that it is no longer just a ladder process? It is very much squiggly because you need to find what best suits what your outlook and what you want to achieve in life is going to be.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you have hit on there, which I think is equally important for both money and career, is ownership and accountability. And it's something you and I have explored before. I think, we are really advocating for people to take ownership for their career. And I think alongside of that, you need to take ownership for your sort of financial health and well-being.
Hmm.
And I am definitely somebody who is guilty of I outsourced that. So we always say don't outsource your career to someone else or somewhere else. but I outsourced my sort of money management to the big companies that I worked for, because they do a bit of the hard work for you. They sort of go, here's a pension, if you're lucky enough, here's some healthcare. And I didn't really take any time to understand it. I didn't really engage with it. I definitely got some what we would describe as gremlins, beliefs that hold you back about
Oh
money.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
I was like, oh well, I wasn't very good at maths at school, so I then sort of just, head. I was definitely a head in the sand type person when it came to my money. And then I remember talking to a few people I worked with, and just realizing that their level of engagement and thought and how intentional they were in terms of their money was so different to mine. And actually I was like, oh, that's just interesting. I feel like I've actually got a really big gap to fill here. And well, it took me a while. It has taken me a few years, because I continued to hope that somebody else would do it for me. And I think I still had that gremlin. And then I've got to the point, probably only in the last 2 years, where I have really started to think about, okay, what's my own attitude to risk? How am I going to manage my own money? Thinking a bit about the future, managing the short term and the kind of medium term. Um, I have now got a kid. I think that sometimes makes you think, oh crikey,
Yeah.
it's not just about me.
Yeah.
I suppose that makes you sort of zoom out a little bit. And also, being really frank. So my dad died about a year ago now, and he died at 64. And so he died 6 months before he was due to receive
State
his
pension.
pension. Yeah,
Mm.
well, he had a final salary pension. So
Oh
who has a
God.
final salary pension anymore? So he had this incredible pension that he never realised. And initially, you might be like, "Oh, crikey, that's such tough timing." Now, actually, when I think about my dad, he loved his job. He loved what he did. He was even thinking about, could he keep working past retirement? Yes, he'd got this incredible pension, but he had actually really thought about the money that he wanted to have for kind of living now, but kind of for
Yeah.
the future. And it was very unexpected. He got a very kind of unexpected illness and then kind of died quite quickly. Um, and actually, because I've been the executor of his will, which is quite bleak, but I've had to really engage with money,
That process. Yeah.
with his money and how he organised it. And he took a lot of accountability and ownership. Uh, and, everyone has to do it in their own way. But I think sometimes you go through a couple of those experiences, probably, you know, those pivotal moments that really make you realise what you're not doing, and also giving yourself credit that I can do this. It might take me a bit of time, and I might have to do it one kind of bit at a time, and ask some good questions and get people around me. But I feel like I've always had that confidence around careers, because that's my day job, that's my area of
Yeah.
expertise. And actually, I have definitely gone through that process of then trying to apply those same principles to how I manage my money. Now, I'm not perfect, I'm not there yet, but I'm so much further forward than I was, say, 2 years ago.
Yeah, and I think it is always a journey, regardless. And
Mm.
just getting started is often the biggest hurdle that you have
Yes.
to jump by. I know that you talk a lot about values, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier, and you touched on it a little bit earlier on. How important are values in the work that we do and the people that we work for? And I'm really interested to hear your take on this for someone who might be employed, because I think sometimes what happens is people will take a job, or you'll take a job because it's necessity, you've got to pay bills. And I don't think oftentimes people really think about, do values actually align? Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Mm. Yeah, it's a great question. So, values can feel potentially a bit fluffy or abstract. So, I think if the word doesn't work for you, just think about what motivates and drives you. Motivators, values, drivers, we're all getting at the same thing, which is essentially what matters most to you. And our values are formed actually as we're growing up, when we're quite young. And it's just sometimes we don't know what they are. We've sort of not surfaced them in a way where we could say them out loud. So if you're coming at values for the first time listening to this, just ask yourself some what's most important to you questions. What's most important to you about what you work on, who you work with, and where you work? That'll get you some quick clues as to what your values might be. And we give you loads of free tools on values. So there's kind of lots of exercises you can do to get started. Once you have a sense, and most people have a bit of a sense of what their values might be, I think they are a really good filter for fit. So my four values are achievement, ideas, learning, and variety. And it takes you a little while to get to those. It's not about doing a process and getting to an outcome. It's about exploring and, giving yourself permission to sit with a few of them, figure
Hmm.
out what are the words that are right for you. Now, your values will never be identical to your organization's values, because organizational values are sort of written for everyone. They're usually
Hmm.
quite far ranging, quite far reaching. And there is definitely there's a big mix in terms of how seriously do organizations take those values.
Hmm.
I work with companies where I'm like, their values are so core to their DNA. It's definitely kind of who they are and what motivates them. And if I think about Amazing If, our values at Amazing If are not the same as my values. So our values at Amazing If are useful, action, energy, and work in progress. So they're not the same.
Hmm.
What I think you can do is get a feel for, can you connect some dots between your values and your organization's values? That's always a good place to start. So if I take Sainsbury's, for example, one of Sainsbury's values was make it happen. One of my values is achievement. And so you sort of go, that's not
Yeah.
a million
Yeah.
miles away. I can
Yeah.
sort of see how I can get there. And there's a reason that I really enjoyed working at Sainsbury's, because my values weren't a million miles away. Um, I also think as part of like an interview process, you can ask some questions around values without saying the word.
Hmm.
So you might ask questions like, what is it that you really enjoy about working at Barclays or at Sainsbury's? And when people start to tell you what they enjoy, or how would you describe working in financial services, or how would you describe working in this company to someone who's not been here before, people start to say words that give you a good hint as to the reality. So, if they're talking about um, it's pretty relentless, and everyone's sort of very committed, but that's great because we all really care. I think, okay, well, that's not for everyone. I remember listening to somebody talk who created his own company, and I was listening to him describe the culture, and I said to him, I was like, oh, it sounds relentless, it sounds like it's not for everyone. And he said, oh yeah, the number one word people use to describe working here is relentless. Now I was like, that is a really good filter for fit.
Hmm.
people and
100%.
people loved working there, but it equally wasn't for everybody.
Yeah.
And so I think there's two things: there's know what matters to you, know what matters to your organization, whether they call them values or not. Then you've also got to figure out how seriously do they take them. And like I say, I think that's a real spectrum.
Yeah.
And the other thing that you sometimes see is, especially in big organizations, maybe sometimes it's more about your team than it is the big organization. So I've also worked in places where I think, well, it sort of didn't matter that much what the values of the organization were. What mattered was the team culture.
Mm.
Um, how does this team work? What are the behaviors that this leader role models? Is that something I want to learn from? Is that something I'm inspired by? How does that fit with the things that are important to me? And I once remember, to give a specific example, being interviewed by somebody in financial services actually, and one of my values is learning. And I was talking to him about how important learning was, and I always wanted to grow and was really curious to learn new things. And I talked about some of the examples of learning that I would like to do, and he was really dismissive of it.
Mm.
So one
Interesting.
of the examples I talked about was like, oh, and at some point I might consider doing an MBA, which I did go on to do. And he was like, oh, that's a waste of time. I don't believe in MBAs. And I was like, and at that point, that was a really good filter for fit. Now, it didn't matter whether it was an MBA or not. I was like, this person doesn't care about learning anywhere near as much as I do. And so that I was like, that's a really good signal that I'm probably not going to really enjoy being in that environment. And so I really remember thinking, oh, that's just not going to be for me.
Yeah.
Whether it's an MBA or not was sort of irrelevant. I remember them interviewing with the next person, same organization, and she was someone who had left school at 16. She'd done incredibly well, squiggled in all sorts of different directions, so not really done any formal education, but she was so supportive of me wanting to do that. And so I had two very different experiences where people were sort of telling me about the values of them as a leader and their team, from someone who could have very rightly been quite dismissive. She'd not done any formal education, and she hadn't needed it, and it's not
Yeah.
what she prioritized. But it was this idea of going, yes, but everybody's different and everyone's
Yeah.
motivated by different things. And I just really remember thinking that's a really good way to get that sense of, am I going to feel fulfilled in this role? Is it going to be a good fit for me? And also knowing it's absolutely okay if you then opt out and just think, do you know what? There are some red flags or warning signs that this is not going to work out, and it is okay to walk away.
Yeah. That example you gave is actually quite a really good one, actually, because in the practicalities of it, you think, well, actually, if you do want to go off and do an MBA, how supportive are they going to be of the fact that actually you might need a little bit of time off work? And if,
Yeah,
as you're saying there, he says, oh, that'd be a waste of time, you can
yeah,
quickly gauge that actually maybe it might be a little bit tough and a little bit more
mm,
stressful than you're willing to take on if you did an MBA and you were in this environment under that person. So that's a really good way of filtering and kind of connecting whether a company kind of aligns with the things that you want to do and the things that motivate you. I know that you guys also talk a lot about investing your own resilience.
mhm.
What does that mean exactly?
So, resilience is one of those overused words, right? We hear it all the time. Organizations talk about, we need everyone to be resilient. I think what we mean is that we know that in a squiggly career, there will be knotty moments. It's inevitable. There are going to be obstacles, stuff out of our control that gets in our way. And feeling like we are stalling or stuck in our careers can feel really frustrating. You can feel quite helpless. And almost, and you can get to the point where you then get very demotivated, and we spend a load of time at work. So that becomes problematic quite quickly. And so we're interested in, how do you invest in your resilience reserves so they are there when you need them, rather
Mm,
than sort of waiting for this thing to kind of come our way. And alongside that, how can we be more resilient? And when I say we, I think there is too much emphasis on the I. How do I build my belief? How do I get more resilient? But we all work in teams. Like, even in a small organization, you work in teams. And so I think it's also something to ask together as a group, like, how can we support each other with our resilience, which
yeah.
I see a lot less of, and I think that's just as valuable. And so, to give you a few examples of what that practically might look like in somebody's working week, one of the things that we know really helps you to stay resilient, from a brilliant psychologist called Dr. Bill Mitchell, is, do one thing every day that is just for you. One thing every day that's just for you. When I often share that in workshops, people can't give me an example of something that they do every day that is just for them. They spend all of their time giving or supporting, and then maybe their home life kicks in and they do even more of that, but in a different context.
Hmm.
And so that's a really small thing that, and it can be 10, it could be 10 minutes of reading a chapter of a book that you want to read. It could be making yourself a nice lunch in the middle of your day. Mine often involves going out for a walk by myself, buying an overpriced coffee, because coffee just seems to get more and more expensive. And so that's like something for me every day. Is like this morning, for example, I just walk out, go for a walk, get a coffee before I sort of start my day. That's one thing for me, almost before I've started, that I've sort of done. So that's always really useful. Another thing that will build your resilience is what's called active rest. So there's sort of resting, which is like sitting in front of the TV, watching Netflix, probably a bit on your phone at the same time. But active rest is something a bit different. It's where you're doing something that is not work, but that you are 100% absorbed and present in. So you're sort of, you have no capacity to think about anything else. And so you're directing all of your brain's energy in a different direction. And it's really good for his active rest. And when I say active, sometimes people are like, oh, but I don't want to go for a run. That's fine. It could be cooking, it could be gardening, it could be gaming. So like, if I watch my 7-year-old playing Harry Potter on the Nintendo, he can barely talk to me when it's happening.
Yeah.
It can be exercise. Almost the filter is, are you 100% in it? There's no space to worry about work, to think about other people or other things. You're very absorbed. Really good for our resilience. It helps us be balanced. It helps us to stay pragmatic. It makes sure we don't run the risk of what's called enmeshment. So enmeshment is when our work becomes who we are. So all of who we are becomes
Mm,
the work that we do. And
mm,
you sort of can't deconstruct the two.
Hmm.
And we all have that risk of enmeshment from time to time. But the problem with it is it leads to burnout, which is bad for all of us in all sorts of ways, like your mental health, your physical health. So get some active rest in, do one thing every day that's just for you, and celebrate your small successes along the way. Our brains have a natural negativity bias. So we are very good at remembering our mistakes or things that don't go so well, or getting frustrated when things don't feel like they are progressing in the way that we want them to. But we skim and skip past the small successes we have every day. So if you wrote down one very small success at the end of every day, you create a more optimistic environment for your brain. And the more optimistic we are, the better we are at three things: spotting opportunities, solving problems, and asking for help. All things that help us to be resilient. And often that exercise sounds easy to do, but in reality, because it's one of our most popular exercises, the first day of doing that, people find really hard. They're like, I haven't got any. And this very small success, by the way, can come from work or home, can be anything. But the really important thing is that you write it down. Don't just say to yourself, "I'll just think about it." We've got to get it out of our heads. Note section of your phone is fine, onto a bit of paper, but your brain processes things differently when you sort of get it out of your brain,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah.
And day 1 and 2 might feel quite hard, but by day 3 and day 4, people tell us they're finding it really easy. They can spot more than one very small success. They're just trying to work out which one to choose, which is great. And then to the point on the we being resilient, that can also be something you do as a team. So every Friday in Amazing If, we do Win of the Week. We use Microsoft Teams. We have an all company channel, and everybody shares their win of the week. It could be volunteering at your kids' swimming lessons. It could be cracking that PowerPoint presentation that's been annoying you. It could be having a difficult conversation with someone. It can be anything. And that builds our collective confidence. That builds our belief as a group, because we see and celebrate all our wins along the way. So if you did those three things all the time, when those knotty moments come our way, that's not the time to start doing those things, because we've already got a lot we're coping with in those moments. But if you've already done those things, you're so much better equipped to sort of get unraveled and kind of to get rid of that knot and be able to move forward.
That's amazing. So many things that you wrote down there. I mean, the one thing a day just for you, I struggle with that for sure. I'm not good at that at all. The other thing, enmeshment.
Mm,
Enmeshment. I definitely, because it's weird, right? Because even in the UK, when we meet someone, what's the first question we ask? What do you do?
what do you
Like,
do? Yeah.
it's weird, right? Because we associate what we do for a living with our personality, with who we are. And the separation of that, that's really hard. It really, really is hard, actually. So many good stuff there. I do have a question, because we've got a segment called Mailbag here. And there was a question that I got on Instagram from a gentleman called Josh. I wanted to ask you, so if you have any insights in this, because it kind of tags onto what we've been discussing. So Josh says here, currently looking for a new career change, but really struggling to make the jump from web industry to design due to a lack of experience. Much of the roles I'm going for will be filled by graduates, but he's 33, he's looking for a mortgage, he's finding it a little bit difficult. Any advice that you would give?
Yeah, great question from Josh there. And I think he's in a position that a lot of people find themselves in. You've been in a certain career for a while, and then you realise you're like, okay, this is perhaps not how I want to spend my time. So I want to develop in a different direction. How do I make that happen? And what we know is that a successful career change is never a sort of silver bullet solution, which I know is always a bit disappointing, because it would be so much easier, wouldn't it, if it was like, do this one thing, great, it's all sorted. What we see time and time again is people changing career. The people who do it very successfully do it through small actions, a series of small actions that get them closer to where they want to go. So for example, that might look like, it could look like passion projects or side projects. It might look like volunteering. It might look like doing one day part-time in something different. If I think about my own experience, my career change is relatively dramatic, both in terms of what I do, but also where I work. Like, my environment is very different now to my corporate career. That was definitely a series of small actions. That was I changed my working pattern from a 5-day week to a 4-day week. So I had one day doing what is now Amazing If. And I did that for a couple of years. I also did what I would describe as a bridging role. I think bridging roles can be really helpful, particularly if you feel like you're hitting a bit of a brick wall. And you're like, sounds like Josh knows what he wants to do, but it's a bit of like, well, I just can't get there. Is there an in-between job? So it might not be ideal, and you're definitely making some trade-offs and some compromises, but you know why you're doing it, because it is getting closer to where you want to go. So for me, for example, I was thinking, I'd only ever been in massive corporates. Can I run a company? I was like, I don't know. It's so far from my experience and my reality. And so I went to be a managing director for a creative agency for a little while. Much smaller company, working for founders. And that was essentially a bridging role. That gave me the confidence and the kind of clarity. I was like, oh, I definitely want to run my own company. I don't want to run someone else's company. I feel like I have got those transferable talents. I've sort of seen them in action. And then great, it's much easier for me to make that move now. So I didn't sort of go, it wasn't sort of really dramatic overnight. It was definitely over the course of a couple of years. And I know some of those things are time consuming and can feel hard. But equally, we balance our must-haves. So, and I was exactly in this position from a kind of money perspective. Must-haves, I was like, right, everyone says start a company and don't pay yourself for a year. And I'm like,
it's not realistic.
Like,
it's not realistic for a lot of people. Yeah.
No, and I was like, so when I moved to Amazing If full time, I got a massive mortgage, and also I got massive flipping childcare costs, because by that point I'd had a kid. And so I was like, oh great, I've now, like, my must-haves in terms of money are actually quite high, like figuring out your enoughs. And I was like, well, that's all well and good, but my enoughs, that number is quite a high number, and
it's not going away either. You've got to tend to it.
Unless I'd have to really dramatically change my life. So obviously I could have sold my house and done something different. I'm not sure what I'd have done with Max, my baby. I'm not going to do something different with him, but I got him by that point. So I was like, okay, I have got to pay myself from day one. And so again, that bridging role helped, because I'd got some cash in the meantime, but then also we were building up some cash in the background with some of the stuff we were doing with my 1 day a week, and Helen, my co-founder, had started to do a bit more work, so that once Helen and then I were working in Amazing If full time, we could pay ourselves a really decent salary from day one, and that was non-optional. It was like, well, if we can't do that, we couldn't do it, so we had to make that happen. And I think then just having the clarity about your must-haves versus your nice-to-haves. Often I think we're imagining everything's going to happen at the same time, back to that kind of binary thinking. Whereas I think what I discovered, certainly myself career changing, was going, right, what are my must-haves in terms of both, like life stuff, day-to-day life stuff, but also the sort of work that I want to do. What are the things that I am prepared to trade off in the short term? And then you just sort of know. I think there's some really interesting work by people like Oliver Burkeman, who wrote a great book called 4,000 Weeks, Time and How to Spend It. It's a brilliant book. And he talks about how we have a very different relationship with choices when we feel in control of them. If we feel like somebody else is making the choice for us, or there's sort of external factors, it's sometimes called our sphere of concern rather than our sphere of control. It's like, if that feels like it's ruling our lives, it doesn't feel great, because we just don't feel in control, and we all want to feel in control. I think when you outline your must-haves and your nice-to-haves, you make some very explicit choices about what matters now and what matters next. And just knowing where I am now doesn't mean this is where I have to stay. And almost just like being very, very clear about those things will then just give you the confidence to kind of go, okay, it's a bridging role, it's a side project, I'm going to do something that I'm really passionate about that's going to help me use those new skills. And then the other thing I would just be looking at, if I was Josh, just very, very practically, I think some organisations are better than others just at sort of embracing people from lots of different backgrounds. They very explicitly say, we recognise that cognitive diversity, so people who bring loads of just difference in all sorts of ways, is really useful for our organisation. We don't want cookie cutter people. And you can just see examples of organizations that talk about that very explicitly, that practice what they preach. They're not just saying it for the sake of it, they sort of really believe it. So maybe they have, it could be just something like a returners program for, maybe it often tends to be women, but not always women, who have been out of work for maybe like 10, 11 years. Now, that's not what Josh wants to do, but if I saw an organisation that had a returners programme, I would think, oh, they're probably more up for me doing a career change than perhaps an organisation that doesn't have something like that. And I think there are sometimes signals and clues that we can look for in terms of which organisations, excuse me, which organisations are more likely to be up for the transferable talents that I've got. We recently ran a big global experiment about squiggle and stay, people sort of staying in organisations but really moving around. And one of the organisation's Specsavers changed their job specs. So they added some wording at the top that basically said, almost like, we're less worried about your exact experience, we're much more interested in your transferable talents. So if you're looking to do something different, like, we're really open to you. So very explicitly giving permission for people to say internally, I work in procurement, quite fancy a go in finance, or I quite fancy a go in marketing. Like, that, don't discount yourself before you even get started. And so if I saw that from an organisation, I'd be like, great, they believe in transferable talents. And I remember myself when I was moving from marketing to corporate responsibility, I thought, wow, I'm quite a high risk hire because I've never done this before, I've got zero experience. The only thing they're getting are my transferable talents. But I just remember the director saying to me, yes, but that's what I'm paying you for. She was like, you can learn the other stuff, and you've got the right people around you. Actually, what really matters is demonstrating that you've got that ability to learn, that kind of infinite learning loop. Like, that's what will matter. And I always think, well, I don't want to go and work for a company where they're saying, oh, well, you don't fit in this exact box. And we like to recruit everybody that looks and sounds the same. So if I was Josh, I would also be looking at things like B corporations, those corporations that take purpose and profit seriously, those organisations that have those kind of initiatives and schemes that just reflect the brilliant uniqueness and difference that we can all bring to our careers.
That's brilliant, and hopefully Josh will find that really, really helpful.
I hope so.
In terms of the answer, there's lots of nuggets in there that you've just given, and it's amazing how you compare, and when you're describing your journey, how you've kind of very intentionally separate out what the must-haves are and what the nice-to-haves are. Because when I do coaching, that's exactly what I go through, and I think that it's applicable in so many walks of life that it's almost the fundamental place to basically begin. I have a final question for you, which is this. If there is a key skill, one key skill that is important that people need to succeed in a squiggly career, what would it be?
To always be learning. So consistently curious, really open, sometimes described as sort of also learning agility. So that sort of embracing new situations, being open and kind of flexible. But just this idea of, we are all now unlearning and relearning all of the time. And I think for lots of us, that might sound easy, like, oh, to have this learning mindset. But most of us grew up in a system where we were told what to learn and how to learn it.
That's true. Yeah.
And that was certainly my reality and kind of the state education that I had, and actually education I had after that. And so I almost feel like we have to relearn how to learn at work, and it's very different from what we might label learning based on our previous experiences. It's not a teacher telling us the answer. It doesn't have to look like going on a course. And so the thing I see, we spend so much time with sort of thousands of people across the world on their careers every year. The people I see who are really just thriving and enjoying their squiggly careers, they've just all got this learning mindset. I can't do this yet. I know I've got neuroplasticity in my brain. I can keep learning. I can keep growing. Hey, do you know what? I will fail, but I'll never fail to learn. I will put myself in those situations where I can discover untapped potential. Might feel a bit scary. We can sometimes call it the courage zone, but I'll go for it when I feel kind of up for it and in the right position to do that. So just this learning mindset, I think, just sets you in really good stead for sort of that squiggly career.
That's amazing. Um, for those people, because one thing I haven't mentioned is the podcast is hugely successful. So if you're listening to this right now, how many downloads do you have now?
Probably just over 4 million, I think.
Okay. So if you're listening and watching this and you haven't actually gone to listen to the podcast yet, it's called Squiggly Careers Podcast, right?
Yeah, that's
Go and
right.
check it out. Go check it out and go and have a little listen. There is so much in terms of what you can pick up and learn. Just from this conversation, I've actually learned quite a bit. But aside from the podcast, how else can people find you and perhaps work with you as well?
So if you go to amazingif.com, we have a free Squiggly Careers toolkit. So for example, if you wanted to spend some time on values, we've got a whole toolkit on values you can download and use. That's all free, so that's really good for free stuff. If you wanted to work with us on leadership or career development programs or those things like Squiggle and Stay, you'll find all our details on there too. Podcast is great. We have a couple of books if you like to learn by reading, which are The Squiggly Career and You Coach You. And we have a TED talk called The Best Career Isn't Always a Straight Line, which I think about 2 million people have watched now.
I
And
watched it.
that's a
I watched
really
it
good.
yesterday. It's very, very
Oh,
good.
did you watch it?
Yeah,
And it's quite a short. We kept it quite short intentionally, so I think it's about a 9-minute TED talk. So if you just want an easy entry to kind of learn a little bit more about myself and Helen and kind of what we believe in, what we stand for, TED talk is probably the best place to start.
fantastic. I'm going to leave links to all of that in the show notes and on YouTube in the description. So feel free to reach out. I hope you found this episode of the podcast helpful. Please provide some feedback. If you would like your question answered in the mailbag section of the podcast, all you need to do is either email me at hello@petercommonaffair.com. I'll put it again in the description and in the show notes on the podcast. But easiest thing for you to do would be to just message me on Instagram, because I can just grab it there and they go into a separate folder. And as and when I have an appropriate expert, if I can't answer it, I will definitely bring it up as something to be answered, and hopefully we can help that way. But I appreciate your time and your attention on this episode. Until next time, have a good one.